Hi, my name is Karen Nelson, and I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture. The BAC has been recognized with distinction for its leadership in educating an extraordinarily diverse student body to help bring about social equity through design, through the designs of landscapes, of interior architecture, of historic preservation, of designs for human health, and more. This spring, we'll be hosting a range of events to complement our original exhibit, Architectures Within Us, selected works from Balkrishna Doshi. Welcome to the first event in our spring 2023 lecture series, Just Environments. David M. Foxe is an adjunct faculty member at the BAC who taught with us for a dozen years, beginning in 2006, and recently returned to us to teach thesis. I rely upon David to innovate curricularly, to ask provocative and significant questions, and to provide thoughtful pedagogical approaches. You will soon see how he brings together his experience and research from his education, his practice, and his understandings of structure. David trained in architecture, research, and music. As a registered architect, he has over 15 years of experience in all phases of architectural design and digital documentation for new construction and transformative renovation projects around the United States and abroad. Most recently, as an associate at Epstein-Jocelyn Architects, he has led the design and construction of performing arts and cultural facilities in hybrid mass timber, steel, and concrete. For his past work at Softy Architects, he was an awardee of the President's Design Award for Jewel at Changi Airport in Singapore. He's now a senior associate at Softy Architects. David has published, taught, and lectured widely in the United States, United Kingdom, and Europe, and he has served as the editorial director and co-author of the structural design textbook, Form and Forces. He served as president of the New England chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians for 5 years. He earned his Master of Architecture degree from MIT, as well as his undergraduate degrees in architecture and music composition. He holds a research degree from Clare College, Cambridge University, as a UK Marshall Scholar. His orchestral and chamber music compositions have been written for and performed in settings ranging from underground storage vaults to iconic landmarks of modern architecture. Please give a warm welcome to David Foxe as he presents his lecture, Materials as Collaborators, Teams, Themes, and Trees.
Thank you all so much. And it has been asked whether this was about memes, and it's about themes, not memes. So I really appreciate the intro, Karen. I am visiting today from, now it's not clicking. There, I'm visiting today from Softy Architects, and it's always been a joy to see the way in which Jewel and other projects have shown up in BAC reviews. Oop, it's off to the races. Can we stop the? That's going to give away the punchline. So I am from, a lot of the work that I'll be showing here is from Epstein-Jocelyn Architects, and I am really grateful for the team that I've had there over the years, and I hope that some of them are able to join today. So to start, I would like to pose two rhetorical questions. First, I would like to have you think, if you were asked to describe a family member or someone that you cared about deeply, and when you were asked if you responded simply that they're brutally honest, would that really be a particular vote of confidence? Like it's a good place to start, but that would be a pretty unfortunate place to remain. And yet this is often what we have to say about architectural uses of materials. We personify them, we ascribe human qualities to them, and we say that they are honest uses of materials, or the opposite. Now, let's think about a second question. What if you're asked to describe a loved one, and instead of saying something about their character, you describe the type of container that they would fit in? What if you described their dimensions, their weight, whether they broaden or taper as they go from one end to the other. This would be somewhere between insensitive and creepy. And yet this is often what we start with architectural descriptions. We start by talking about their massing as if their massing is somehow before their form and before their material. So given that the non-architectural public seeks resonance and meaning in the experience of materials and craft, why not pursue these things and these different considerations simultaneously rather than sequentially? So this is an approach that I am hoping to articulate today, that this would illuminate the human involvement at each step and expand the possibilities for tectonic expression so that we can personify materials, not just as being able to be truthful or to be lying, but to be personified in other ways as members of a team with all the nuances and all the challenges that it takes with human collaboration. Thus, my title is Materials as Collaborators, Teams, Themes, and Trees. So let's get a little bit of default stuff out of the way. We're going to close something. Yeah. Okay. So a little bit of default stuff to get out of the way. So first of all, personification is not buildings that look like their owner. This is not about how like people look like their pets. That would be a different lecture than what you're attending today. So rather, when I talk about personification, I realize that I'm indebted to a very long history of architects and historians who have written about this. In particular, Jacob Voorthuis, who's a Dutch professor I met in Eindhoven about 15 years ago, who has traced this history from Plato through the Enlightenment and all of the more recent polemics on this. Essentially, it can be boiled down to a lot of 19th century theses and ideas that ascribed a lot of immorality to a variety of non-structural columns and pilasters and the sort. And so Voorthuis argues that we have the need of a concept of the tectonic, which reflects current building practices and therefore clarifies that with a tectonic approach, the construction is the intended spatial effect. And with an atectonic approach, these materials are instead serving the intended spatial effect. They both exist. They often exist in the same building. They often exist in the same Greek restaurant. And they therefore are both things that we should consider. And he points to how getting beyond mere truth allows us to talk about how architectural materials and styles and designs can be forthright or evasive, could be polite or rude. They could be quietly subtle or brash and gregarious. So let's consider a default condition. This is a house. It's neither a great house nor a horrible house. It is framed in conventional materials and it has a wrap that needs to be clad. So the issue here is not honesty. The building is honestly built this way, and it honestly could have any cladding. The issue here is that this is passive house design. It's so passive that the person waited to put it up on Reddit to get feedback before they would ask for validation and put their cladding on the house. And it therefore means that they could have any combination that they could ever want. And you may make fun of it, but this actually happens. This is a house that was built down the street from me by a former architect, and it definitely happens. So let's move up a scale. This is Hudson Yards, which is not at Home Depot. So this is, I would argue, much in the same direction. There's some excellent architecture going on here, but the choices of materials and massing and structure are all occurring separately. And therefore, it's, in a sense, these things could change with the market. These things could change with the whim of all sorts of different people. It's architecture embodying a fear of commitment. So I will pick an example that I walked past. I did not know the architect. I really even didn't know the client, but it's from a group of firms. It's a project in New York City. The participants are not here to speak to their own projects. So I'll just say they are brought to you by the letters K and T, and they have many collaborators. It's owned by NYU, and it's a 700,000 square foot replacement for a mid-century brick gymnasium that's in the center with a bunch of performing arts and other academic uses. So this is what it looks like in person. And essentially, it sits between two different eras of urban construction. On the right, you have 19th century and 20th century construction that are stylistically very varied, but they have a strong relationship to gravity. Their spans may be in wood or in cast iron or steel, but their rhythm tells us about their skeleton, and their suit of dress tells us their fashion for the occasion. They had an implicit consensus about what technologies and what ideas could be used. And this was a relatively short-lived period. We could work from those buildings backwards into a massing model, but I can assure you that they were not done in foam or in SketchUp or in Rhino. On the other hand, to the left are mid-century buildings. They too have a huge range of opacity, from transparent to fully solid, but I would argue that their form was likewise inseparable from their tectonic. These were not being value engineered from glazed curtain walls to concrete or from concrete to curtain wall. Rather, this was its own massing, form, tectonic, and material all in one. Instead, what we seem to have in all sorts of parts of the industry are this curious situation where the form is driven by the massing and the material is therefore a distinct decision. So early studies of this project, not mine, but just from seeing what's elsewhere in the industry, show that there were clearly many ranges of cladding considered. But in the end, the sheer complexity of all the different things that had to stack, all the different things that had to transfer, and just the whole range of things meant that essentially the overlying thing became glassy. The aim was to be fostering connection, as it says in the lower right. This aim was meant to be welcoming and hospitable. And these personified qualities became equated with transparency. They look one way in a render. They look a little different in real life. I don't really have an opinion about this. I know that this has some of the best team members and some of the best and most innovative glazing procurement in the world. And it costs about $1 billion, but it's relying very strongly on one team member, the curtain waller. So I would ask if we could find other ways to achieve the personification of qualities beyond openness and welcoming, beyond the curtain wall, beyond the insulated glazing unit, if only to have a wider range of tools in case our clients are assuming the default of steel framing or of curtain wall or of other things. So what if instead of looking at the default results and the default models and the default beams on our screen, we looked at the materials and the teams involved? In this, I am highly inspired by someone named Lillian Marlin and her construction photographs, which capture many of the pieces that are on this. It's part of why I picked this project. I could find things like this. And so what if instead of an interior expression that again was entirely separate from the structure, from the enclosure, what if there was something where that teamwork, the value of all that human work were to be apparent in the end? And by teamwork, I don't just mean like the big giant names that we occasionally see on things. You know, this is from the Beinecke, and you'll find this in all sorts of places. It's rare to actually find the builder and the architect in the same font. But the thing is that, like, what can we learn from the boots on the ground or the boots in the air, as it were? So for the rest of this, I'm going to talk about the human team, and I will use my photos from the past few years, many from projects here in Massachusetts. So first, every material can point towards a strategy. I don't mean a material strategy, I mean a thematic strategy, a strategy for unifying all the different parts of a project. This is a welcome center. It is a restroom and welcome booth in Salisbury, Massachusetts. It's near the mouth of the Merrimack River and the border of New Hampshire. The goal was to have it mark that you were at the beach, even though the water was not visible until you got past the fried dough. And so this is a way of dealing with a challenging context. This is my first project that is across the street from a strip club. So the challenge here is storms. This is right near the coast, and the challenge is not new. The storms are even among the earliest things that they chose to make postcards of in advertising the benefits of making the long trip to Salisbury, Massachusetts. And so I would argue that storms and wind loads are not new, but our response to them is. we have now gotten much more comfortable with the idea of elevating structures based on code and climate risk. But even after you decide, oh, it will be elevated, it will have no fossil fuels, it will be naturally ventilated, it will have accessible restrooms throughout the year, it will have flexibility. Even if you answer all of those questions, it doesn't tell you what form you need. So we looked at, among other things, the now demolished recreational things that had been there 100 years ago. And we also understood that building in a marine climate with salt and sand and all those challenges is a real clarifying experience. So in this setting, exposed steel would have all sorts of challenges. It must be marine grade, and doing that at the scale of the full building is really cost prohibitive. Likewise, exposed concrete is going to be very vulnerable, particularly if there's water or ice accumulating on it. And light wood has all sorts of vulnerabilities too, but thicker timber and laminated wood has a stronger track record. It's been used for many decades in older park structures. So we took up the possibilities of a team led by trees, even with all the challenges of a natural material. This is southern yellow pine. It's a wood that's readily farmed, able to be treated and laminated, and it can be curved while it's being glued. We'll come to that in a moment. And as part of this, we recognize the material can inform the form and made the curves gradually change to reconcile different site conditions and to help reconcile where parts would be solid or trellised or other things. This meant that multiple bidders could curve the wood if it was well defined, and therefore it could be suitable for public bid. So we took this a step further and said, well, for each particular material, can it bend and can it twist? A question we might ask of our team members. Concrete and steel, they had already left the building. So they're going to do the foundation. That was about it. But if you ask plywood, it's willing to say yes, especially if it's willing to show up in thinner layers. The layering could form agreement with the structural needs and make the entire curved plane a rigid diaphragm. Rigid insulation gets pretty nervous about bending, but spray foam is willing to participate, especially if it's willing to agree that the beams and the wood are non-conductive. Spray foam gets to be a pretty good team member in that regard. And finally, roofing, which is a material that we rarely consider early in a project, but I think it's important here. And it too, again, with some gentle coaxing, was willing to do a little bit of twisting. Now, many team members were not willing to twist. The rot-resistant wood that was being used in the trellis, not going to twist. Light fixtures, really difficult to twist. So many things were going to be segmented, and that's not their fault. That's just what they were. And what's interesting is that this meant that all of the special geometry would be occurring within a factory, not something that had to be resolved on site. So it gave some clarity. Now, literally every other aspect of this project changed one or multiple times during design, bidding, and construction. Anyone do public work in the room? Okay. The foundation changed. The foundation pattern changed. The deck height changed. The ramps changed. The stair changed. The operational approach to insulation changed. The length of the overhang changed. Someone had an opinion about the shape of the overhang. The accent colors changed. The focal point involving flags changed. The flags moved. This was not the cheapest roof, but because the visual form was equated with agreement among all of the different parties involved in a public project, it meant that the other alternatives couldn't just be clad or get a guy to do something or something. It wouldn't meet the political climate or the oceanside climate, and therefore the form and the material stayed. These materials can become assemblies that even with all their limitations means that they can be used systematically. Not as a science project, but in pursuit of the experience that can end up resulting. Now, the value of this to people is not in all the technical things that I'm talking about. No one looked up to this and said, wow, look at that form embedded in a material choice. All they see in it is that this is something that connotes care. It means that people looking around are able to say, wow, can you believe they did that for us here? In other words, not for a more wealthy destination, not for a fancy place, but for a place that has a wide range of people coming to it. And this had all the challenges of a public project, but in the end, the overall gesture feels like it does welcome people to the beach. And so I will say that it's okay. Second, every material implies a team, and it brings with it the assumptions about teamwork. So as we did before, let's go up a scale. This is the Groton Hill Music Center. It's about 125,000 square feet of building on agricultural land. It serves as a community music nonprofit and it was built with a single donor. It has halls for 300 and 1,000 people, plus practice teaching and support facilities. I believe it is the largest mass timber performing arts facility in the region. It opened last fall, and its first full concert is this weekend. So you guys are probably among the first people seeing it in this state. Even with all the wood dominating, it's important to recognize that it's a hybrid with uses of concrete, steel, and timber, all serving roles, team roles that are architectural, structural, and acoustic in nature. The key design approach is one that unifies the wood for structure, acoustics, and finish. So after 7 years and 261 site visits, there are many stories that I could tell about this, but the ones we're going to focus on today are about how materials apply an approach to teamwork that goes beyond the typical office site visit. And they include asking who is going to make something and where, who is going to transport it and how, who needs to be present, and what do all these other people assume and why. So if you use concrete, someone has to get the rebar and formwork into place from ground level down low, going down 20, 30 feet, or high, going up a distance that I was grateful to stay on the ground. Therefore, it's a material that takes weeks or even months, but it's also the material of minutes. It's all about the quality of the pour, the weather, the team members, as good or as bad as the batch or the crew that arrives. It's the first trade, it's the first material to occupy space permanently. And its ability to take on the form in any space is a freedom unlike steel and timber and things that arrive with great precision. For this kind of project where we could not be allowed as designers to ask the concrete to be crafted in a way that it would be exposed, it was the team member of mass. It was not only there for compressive foundations, but to act in bending for box beams, for lateral systems, and to be the mass around the acoustic spaces. Now, if you use steel, someone can arrive with trucks and cranes and make all sorts of progress even before their morning break. Steel initially seems like a material that's far quicker, but all of that speed assumes that it can be hidden by acres of acoustic ceiling tile, that it can be sprayed with fireproofing, that it can be left out of sight, even if it is just above the frozen foods aisle or above some other typical space. So for this role in this project, steel had the background role to support light metal framing of interior volumes, but also to be paired with wood, to be truss members where steel could be more optimized in tension. Now, if you use wood, it is the natural material that we are spoiled with in North America. It is so readily available in its lightest form. It can be speedy, it can be readily adaptable, but it reaches limitations at scale. And so it is in its larger heavy timber or mass timber applications that it has the strength and resistance, and yet it requires more careful thought. So this is a sequence that shows a group of these beams being lifted into place. And so I would like to tell you a little bit about what the approach of this was. There are 3 large halls. They each have a different span. They each have a different shape that was governed by their acoustic requirements. And they each use glulam tuning forks. They are not wishbones. Wishbones break. Tuning forks do not break. The shapes and the curvature were governed by acoustic diffusion patterns and where sound would be reflected. And from that, there was a system of these tuning forks that would march along. Each wall would then be formed with decking set in notches into the columns, and concrete, the dark gray stuff, being attached behind it. So the way that you start with this is that you have glulam in a factory. It's finger jointed, each piece. It's very ordinary wood. It's laid up with really messy glue that all squeezes out, and it's bolted and clamped and everything on a big flat floor. Once the one mock-up that we got was made, it was then shot with shotcrete, and the acoustician checked it for solidity. And so when it comes out onto the site, these things plant their feet in the ground. They're very stable when you spread your legs like that, and therefore they could be erected in pairs. As each one would go up, it would get its steel truss, and then the decking would connect. Just as with the prior example, all the geometry would have been done in a factory, hopefully, and then it would be brought and erected. This also meant that the rebar attachments and everything could follow in sequence for the concrete, lots of rebar. And so then you'd have the skeleton of a form that had been derived from the inside out, and then had concrete going onto each bay. So what you have is lost formwork that gets abandoned in place, essentially, and then insulation and other things wrap the outside. Metal diamond tile clads the surface of the insulation, and you have sunset, and you have a recital hall. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's the basic story. And so by the time we get to the acoustic testing of it, you can see that there's a lot of teamwork of materials going on here. This literally close teamwork of materials, right? The wood not having enough mass, the concrete being there for mass and for shear planes, and all of this being connected together. It is often difficult. It requires people to interact. It requires people to go away and come back. It requires trades to do things that they would not have the assumptions of doing. This is something that many people will find challenging. Some people will find it builds pride. Some are only going to want to do the minimum and leave, but a few will get interested. Some things will be done with grace, such as on the left, and some things will be done less gracefully, such as on the right. If you are a designer and you know how your design implies this interaction, you can be a more helpful participant, regardless of how a particular contractor chooses their means and methods. You can help to answer the why and the what. There's another reason to understand this that could be its own lecture in itself, which is that each material has its own ecology. In this regard, I'm indebted to Kyle Moe and to Michael Sorkin and countless other people who have pointed out how much material extraction is required of the products we rely on, the aluminums, the composites, the plastics, even glass. It's through these materials that require substantial energy that we get to see that each material implies a team, and that the team's ecological footprint may span many, many continents. So why not have fewer materials that you can understand better and have a stronger relationship with? So in this regard, every material can multitask. Every material can collaborate, but only if you make it inevitable. It can't be optional. This multitasking tells us about their personality. It also may tell you about your personality, but that's another question entirely. Every material can be part of your daylighting solution if you shape them with that in mind, but it must be there from the start. No one will be willing to change your structure because you want light to just, but like if you are willing to shape with these things in mind and to build into it the idea of where there are openings, these can all be a part of the way that it participates in natural light. All materials can be part of your thermal comfort if you consider their conductivity and how they provide pathways for air. All the concrete that you're not seeing here is providing plenums underneath the performers, plenums underneath the audience. The gaps that you're not seeing between the ceiling and the windows are providing the return air pathways. The wood curtain wall is providing a different expression that I would argue is both literally less conductive and warmer in its appearance than an aluminum curtain wall. Your building can either be warm and hospitable or cool and off-putting. It can be personified. All materials can perform acoustically if you consider their mass, their surface properties, their absorption, and their reflection and diffusion. Your designs can be good listeners or they can be loud shouters. We've all met an architectural design that shouts loudly. All materials can have projective surfaces if your projection is mapped accordingly. They can have their own personality and still showcase that of others. They can be not just for images and for video, though we're certainly seeing this across many art spaces, including ones like this that I have no connection to. But these surfaces can be images and sources for illumination of all sorts of artificial light. If you just consider what it will be like for light to wash across. In fact, all of these materials can communicate care or effort or other intangible qualities and tell them something about the people who cared enough to make them happen, not just to design them, but to lug them into place, to make sure that they got there, all the other activities that I, as a non-contractor, would not even begin to understand. The mechanism is that every material that you're personifying brings its own connotations. It brings it through meaning. Materials have baggage just like your other team members, just like people. When you choose to place a material like metal shingles in an agrarian context, you bring with it all of the baggage, all of the comparable conditions that resonate, even if they're being applied to new forms. It resonates with where you've experienced something like that before on a barn or on a silo. While we're on shingles, though, there's a reason that the shingle style, Vincent Scully moment, look him up if you don't know him. There's a reason that the shingle style was not just about cladding. It was about the forms and the compositions of asymmetry. It connected the material expression and the massing. And I would argue that this allowed for what we could call fluency, where the material could be used fluently around shapes and surfaces, flat and curved and otherwise, that showed an understanding of the limitations and possibilities. This is why there will never be a vinyl siding school of architectural history. It was a cladding independent of massing. With wood, when you apply this to new forms, you open up this whole realm of connotational possibility for good or for evil. Is it like inhabiting a tree, or is it like inhabiting a forest? Is it like being on a ship? Is it like being inside a piece of furniture? Is it like being inside a musical instrument? This is my fear with the so-called mass timber skyscrapers, of which I have not designed any. These are the things that are made of cross-laminated products like CLT and NLT and BLT and all the other forms of this, that in their hurry to claim their heights, that they're covering it in curtain wall and therefore concealing their greatest strength. And this is not true of all of them, but it's true of some of them. As we know from daily experience, even just down the street, glass is generally dark or reflective. Even if it's low iron glass, it is not a local commodity that has regional terroir. It is not something that bears patina. If you want something with glass to age or weather beautifully, it's going to need to be something with a handle, something where there's something attached to it. It does not show the imprint of those who made the curtain wall. It shows the handprint of those who clean the curtain wall. So if glass and its expression is truly essential, and since I tossed this up at the beginning of the lecture, I can't completely abandon it, then perhaps maybe use its non-transparency as a feature. Make the faceting subtle in a way of showing its qualities of light. This was to some extent our approach for the glazing at Groton Hill. It showed that by faceting, leading from the acoustic qualities, that it meant that you got this slightly differentiated expression. One might even say that this faceting could be considered jewel-like, but I will leave jewel and softy projects for a future time. So to wrap this up, in the garden of material possibilities, we have become seduced by the ever-present temptation of steel. We have gotten used to the idea of structure clad in unrelated materials. We might even say that we elevate it on a pedestal as a default. This is from David Macaulay. We have even used it when the context tells us of so many other materials because we've arrived at massing and cladding separately. There's nothing wrong with an atectonic approach. It is not immoral. You are not bad, but it is only one option. And steel can be such a good team member with other materials as well. Among the most enthusiastic team members for the wood was the person providing the steel in this project. If you consider the teamwork of materials, you run the risk of many conversations with contractors throughout the project. It will not be something that happens automatically. You will be a busy person. But if you do not consider the teamwork of materials, the concern is that this places the architecture inside of the aesthetic realm. It puts it into the aesthetic preferences of the moment rather than larger strategic goals. And if we want architecture to embody and personify the most lasting of our institutions, if we want it to have the dependability of the things that we trust and want to last, like CVS, if we want the places to really have substance, they're going to need more than a column cover and a sky of suspended ceiling tile. As an architect, you have many limitations. Many decisions are in the realm of other people. Many things rest on the client. One of your few remaining roles is that of suggesting materials that will get placed at human level and overhead. You can't even require them, you're just suggesting them. The materials that are at the height of the hand or the head are where we look the building in the eye. They aspire to be a firm handshake. They are the personification of a greeting. Materials overhead are where we see potential. It's where we wonder about the long arc of aspirations. They're not for getting lost in the details. They're for looking up at a constellation of ideas. Both close at hand and up far away, trees are not just good team members because they grow, but because their growth shows time and all of its imperfections. And we have grown to understand the imperfections taken together to form a quality. We call it grain, and we discuss it as an expression of something that has value. Now, some of you know that I worked with building science educator Edward Allen on his last book for structures published in 2009 called Form and Forces. Some of you in this room may have even had to use the book at various times here. This building in Groton happens to be the only one that involves people from both his cohorts of teaching. Me from the last generation that he mentored at MIT in the 2000s, and my principal, Alan Jocelyn, from Ed's first generation of teaching at MIT decades earlier. This building in Groton was also the last one that Ed was able to see in person briefly when it was under construction in 2019, before he passed away from Parkinson's in 2020. Ed's teaching here at the BAC is one of the many threads in the educational fabric of this institution. In one of his shortest writings, reviewing another designer's work, Ed wrote the following: "Many years ago, while still a student, I formulated a goal for myself, and I still believe it to be a worthy one, that each building I design should be more fascinating at the time of its completion than at any time during its construction. This has proven to be difficult, if not impossible to achieve. A partially finished building reveals countless Pyreneesian wonders and mysteries that are later concealed, and possesses the inherent tension and multiple imagined possibilities of a creative work in progress. How can one retain and reveal, for the enjoyment of the occupant and the onlooker, the endless, constantly changing thrills of construction? Somewhere out there, waiting to be discovered, but virtually unattainable, is a way of building in which the risky, heady euphoria of experiment and artisanry remains, sometimes restless and unsettling, sometimes cumulative and reassuring, to assure and give a building's occupants new insights each day in perpetuity into the work of making and of occupying architecture. It is my sincere hope that this work I've shown has advanced this aspiration and has offered a way to personify some of the aspects and qualities that he brought to architecture. I thank all the many team members from every discipline on the architecture and design and construction teams, and the client who brought these works to life. And I thank you for your time. And if you want to see.
I'm going to take questions.
Just said that I will repeat the questions from Zoom. Yes, to the room. Hello, room. Yes.
So I'm Mike Bryan. First of all, just introduce myself. My question is based on a kind of developer point of view. As an architect, when you're going into that conversation, you want to promote the idea of a beautiful and sustainable design, but mass timber, of course, has its nuances and its heaviness now. So how do you go into that space and try to push for a material focused design when you're facing reality, if that makes sense?
I don't believe that the term mass timber was used in any client or public presentation for any of the work that I showed today. It's merely justified that this is the design and people liked wood.
What is sustainability to you?
The question was, what is sustainability to me? Oh. I think that it would involve some math of resource and all sorts of complexities that are outside of the architectural realm and but it doesn't reduce your ability to do something slightly better. The only other time I've presented this was in a conference on shell structures and timber and bio-based. I was in the bio-based, I was the plant-based person. And it was, the people following me were using only wood and wood joinery and sticks that had been cut, and they did not want to use nails because nails were in metal and metal had a carbon footprint. I believe in nails and screws and other fasteners for the moment. So I struggle with the definition of sustainability that would restrict the use of fasteners such as nails and screws.
You can see it here from Elvira Gassett, who graduated last year. One of the most difficult tasks has been to start introducing timber construction to Florida and existing clients. They're very unreceptive. What have been some of your positive experiences introducing timber in buildings to clients short term?
Do not have a great deal of experience in Florida. I am aware that, like California, it is not a separate country. It's part of the union, but it is it has many differences and distinct qualities to it. So I would hesitate to make a blanket statement that would apply to Florida.
Something that was confusing, and David said that he went by really quickly. That's how he's thinking. Then he was another question.
Our front row participant, yes. Yeah.
So I think one thing that you didn't really touch on, at least besides the fact that you helped design a music hall, is your music background. How do you feel like that's been an influence to your work as an architect?
It's a good question. I will repeat the question. The question was, how does my music background affect the design of this? It's a complicated question. I generally kept my music sides and my architecture sides intrinsically and emphatically separate. And I did so for many years. The past 7 years, I mean, I've worked on auditoriums, I've worked on other project types that involve sound, but this is the first time that the past 7-8 years have been among the first times that I've allowed the two sides of my background to have any interaction. It's a challenge, and it's also that what I might bring to it, there are insights that you bring to a program type if you've used some of the spaces. It brings a familiarity. If you've worked in a lab and you design a lab, if you bring a feeling about, you've been in a sports stadium and you design a stadium, there's many things that highly recommended to have actually been in any of the spaces that are involved. It does help. But it does mean that your approach to music, your approach to one's own approach to these things may or may not be what the client or the user or all the other entities involved are. So I would say it's important to depersonalize that. And in the same way that you would not design the house you want for the house client that you're designing it for, you would need to sort of use that same tool to try to both understand, but not necessarily to have it be your own. Yes.
Hi, are you familiar with autoclave aerated concrete? And if so, what do you think of it? And do you think it has a future in this country?
Question is about AAC, autoclave aerated concrete, otherwise known as concrete with bubbles, or the aerobar from Britain, if you've with the analogy of cement to chocolate. I am familiar with it. I am struck by the challenge that we had on this project of needing such mass and needing the heaviness of concrete. In a traditional building, I guess I didn't say this, but a traditional concert hall, you build a big massive shell, and then you build a separate, really massive inside. You build the building multiple times. This aligns all of that, but it was unusual because, again, most of the people doing the plant-based work want to get rid of all the concrete or to minimize it. And here it was necessary for one reason or another. Same reason we looked at CLT for the project. It would have been lovely, except that it would have been covered by miles of gypsum and concrete. So it's important to think of mass as being sometimes desirable for some project types. And so the idea of reducing mass or reducing material, I think it's one tool to have in the toolbox. I don't know that it's a magic tool. Yes.
At what point in your process do you typically start thinking about the material?
The question is, when in my process do I start thinking about the material? So I'm representing a firm that I have a strong and highly positive opinion of, and I am also in some ways representing the firm that I am at now at Softy. And I would say that there are, in most of the experiences that I've had of design, the material is intrinsic from the start. It's not, it may not always be explicit, but that this is a massing that relates to concrete and the overhangs you can do in concrete. This is a massing that relates to steel and the types of overhangs or not overhangs or shapes or things you can do in steel. But I think that the idea that those would be pursued separately is something quite recent. And I'm guilty of making comments to my students of saying, like, this is something quite recent, such as from the Enlightenment, that, you know, I guess, is the past 300 years recent? Yes. But I do think that there have been material assumptions built into most architecture, that the Gothic cathedrals were not tested in a variety of VE materials. And so the idea that our good works of architecture doesn't mean we can't pursue alternatives, but that if the material changed, it may very well be a different building. And that, like, the building that we're in, it is a concrete building. It's not just sort of kind of a concrete building. It really, really is a concrete building. And it's from a particular time and understanding of concrete that's not 1920s concrete. It's not 2020 concrete. So I think it's quite all right to let materials be there from day one. I'm designing a 5-story, 400-foot long brick, whatever it is, that, like, if you can say its size, if you can say anything about it, why not also say that you want it to be brick, or you want it to be, you know, grounded, or you want it to be welcoming, or you want it to have a sense of gravitas? Like, why not start with the quality of it, the personified quality that might even be a word that your client knows, and then be able to work from that to what the material is.
is a bit more philosophical, but do you see what you're doing this more just emphasize the material of the form, or do you more or less project that the title of the economy overall, or see it at the same time?
Question, I think, was whether the material is separate from the concept or separate from the form or aligned. Separate ideas or not. See, this is where it's showing up that I've given presentations for many, many years, but not about my own work. This is really an unusual circumstance to be having. I would say that they can be aligned and you then have to be responsible for keeping them aligned, or you have to, I have the idea that this is not the setting for which they will be aligned, and that you need to pursue that and avoid them to keep them from tripping over one another. So I think that it doesn't mean that like this is the only way of doing things. If I thought that this was a common approach, I don't think I would be sharing it. But I think that it's an approach, and I think it's an approach that you could connect to a pretty wide range of project types and project participants, in that even if you're designing a house, there's an assumption in New England about what kind of wood framing that will be. It's not identical to doing the same thing in California. It's not identical to doing the same thing for Florida man. It's not the same thing for doing what you would do in Northern Europe. It's not the same thing that you would certainly do in other climates. So I would say that it's only that there are assumptions you haven't yet articulated, if that you're just not yet voicing the assumption about what something is going to be made of.
So now that masculine insurance fire requirements or allows for more exposed to how do you think materials that we design?
The question was, with the adoption of IBC codes, will materials changed? When I went to MIT, I often sat next to someone in materials science who, when he heard that I was looking at new materials, was completely terrified because a new material in the periodic table had not been discovered in several years. And he was very surprised for that to be occurring in a department other than his own. So I do not believe that the materials will change one bit. I do think that the products and the lingo are going to change. And I do think that the desirability, if the industry can make timber appear newfangled and trendy, anything can happen. And so I am struck by, in the course of going from a structural design textbook in 2009 that talked about glulam and timber, but the term mass timber did not exist then. It was a buzzword. It's not a bad one. It didn't have enough mass for me, which is why I didn't use, strictly speaking, one of those products. But the idea that over the course of a decade that terms and that products and that assumptions can make their way all the way in, from not having really been on the table to being in building codes, I think that will be quite innovative and quite an opportunity. I think that this is the time to understand how to use the big giant things that are not going to change, so that you can be ready for whatever the new thing that's going to come on the table. Karen has a question.
Organize construction documents to encourage collaboration between materials and teams.
How does one organize construction documents to encourage, maybe not require, but to encourage collaboration between team members? It's a good question. Construction documents are generally articulated in a way, especially for public bid, that they want as little ambiguity as possible. And so even the last little bit of coordination between something like siding or enclosure would want to have been arrived at ahead of time. I think it depends on the people attached to the process. The first project that I showed was a single phase public bid. The second project that I showed had a long stream of multiple deliverables for schedule reasons. And so I think that I often write emails and transmittals that are of the equivalent of caution, the beverage you are about to enjoy is extremely hot. And I would say that saying this is what you are about to receive, it is for this purpose, it also relates to something else you've seen. Being able to just say what you are about to receive is a strong tool, because then at least you've said it. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone understood it or heard it, but it at least means that if there is something that is to be said, that you have said it in that moment. But those don't go on construction documents, so that's.
It's great. Mike, another question.
So I think, so as we're sitting here, considering just looking at timber designs, you know, you realize a lot of those design for where wood is the structure, it's kind of predicated by a sustainability rating system, or like a well, or LEED certified, and that kind of pushes the design element. During the construction of those buildings that you presented, at any point, was it, oh, we are doing this because of LEED, we're doing this because of this, or was it really, here's the design, here's the outcome?
There were the question is about LEED, well, and third-party rating systems, sorry. There were no LEED, well, or third-party rating systems in any of the work that I shared today. I will save comments about LEED, well, and third-party rating systems for when I'm not in a microphone. Question, which is a very good one and a dicey one, was there places where we had to compromise and where the wood in its appearance was somehow, you know, something that we struggled with, or it had to be replaced by something else? There's a lot of wood on this project that was non-structural and non-everything, like it was millwork, right? So like a lot of the wood that you're seeing throughout it was definitely not the structural wood, but was millwork or was other construction. You know, all the railings, all the this, that, and the other thing. I will only say that the amount, nearly every part of this project had to accommodate many changes based on the team members involved. Sometimes that meant going from wood to tectum. Sometimes it meant going from wood to gypsum. Sometimes it meant going from all sorts of different things. So I am sharing this not as a vision of a project that matches what its original intent was. This is a project that represents a lot of negotiation with the different team members that were involved. And hopefully it will still have a lot of the desired effects. And a question here.
Talking a lot about how things are changing through the process. Do you try to work out as much as possible beforehand to avoid those changes? Or do you kind of leave certain things to be determined after construction documents are issued and say, we're going to work with who's there?
The question is about how much, if I rephrase the question slightly, how much do we design given the parties that are involved versus sort of designing and seeing who shows up. I think that that's a question that's specific to each project. I think that there would be a challenge if you were, there are projects that start with the assumption of what quality of work cannot occur, and then work backward from that to a series of products that can be bought and can therefore be reliable. You know, I am always amazed when I see work like what Payette and others did at Amherst that got beautiful architectural concrete in the state of Massachusetts, and knowing all the challenges of that, or knowing the challenges of other exposed work. So I think it's less about, do you think about it ahead of time, and more so just like, where are you placing your trust along the way? And if your trust is in your ceiling tile product to solve something, then that may be a very wise thing to do. There are many products that are on and each of these projects that were exceedingly important. And, you know, trusting a durable wall tile at a really beat up bathroom by the beach is a really important thing to trust. You know, if we had to come up with a hand-done piece of art for the wall tile, that, you know, much better to have something that can be ordered from a catalog. So I think that it's definitely a challenge in thinking about the lifespan of a project and where there are people attached to it. Thank you all so much.